So as per the caveat about time zones, one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is whether things are real or whether they're not. At the moment, my body is telling me it's a very, very different time to what it is now. And that's having fairly strong material effects on me in terms of how awake I am. But it's also something that's been carried through a lot of the work that certainly I've done with Tobias and the kind of larger work I've done around anthropology and digital art as well. So what I'm going to be talking about today is this idea of where the context of speculative design and more generally critical and speculative interventions happen. So not necessarily the thing itself, but where do they live, where do they sit, and what effects do they have? That's really the thing that I care about, and particularly with reference to kind of materiality, to bodies, to political systems, to infrastructure. How does this stuff actually operate beyond the things itself? Who's engaging with it? What's going on? This quote has been doing the rounds on Twitter, particularly in the past 2 weeks or so, and I am going to be starting off by talking about the referendum, because if we're talking about speculation and imaginaries, political systems are kind of where it's at in terms of thinking about what claims are made, what's being promised, what's being ushered in. So yeah, more and more everything around us is fictional. That is, it's invented to service somebody's imaginative ends, whether it's a politician's or an advertising agent's or our own. It's particularly prominent in the field of politics. So we think about this with design stuff, of kind of prototyping. We think about this in terms of the unreal, the imagined, the speculative. But it kind of, this stuff bleeds. It has a very strong heritage from other places. A lot of the work that Tobias and I have done with government talking about speculative design, people have rightly said that this kind of also locks into a lot of foresight stuff as well, how you're trying to kind of get from here to there. And that in itself is interesting, but it's this part of it's like it's to somebody's imaginative ends. What is the purpose of this? How is it being wielded? How do you interact with it? How do you know if it's real or not? I couldn't find the photo, but from one of the RCA design interaction shows last year, there was this wonderful piece that somebody had made, which was a robot surgery kit. Very large, very complex.
I showed it yesterday.
Yeah, so exactly. Did you show the caveat that came with it?
I didn't.
So the caveat is the most interesting thing. So the kit itself is beautiful. It's lovely. Next to the kit, there was this huge kind of piece of kind of block text, probably about the size of this plinth, that basically went through everything along the lines of, this is not real. This is not for surgery. Don't do surgery with it. Don't think you can do surgery with it. Don't buy it and do surgery with it. Don't sell it and do surgery with it. It can't do surgery. If you do surgery with it, you're going to die. We take no responsibility for it. The designer takes no responsibility for it. The RCA takes no responsibility for it. Just like now, this huge thing. Whether it had come through lawyers, whether it had come through the student itself, this glorious kind of like extra bit of context against the speculation. Like, this is, no, don't. So, it's that kind of thing. Like what power this stuff has. And for an end of year show, that was entertaining, and I enjoyed seeing that very much. But when we think about what speculations mean, when they actually start to spill over into the real, we get somewhere else. So, who recognises this bus? Yeah? Thank you. Apart from Tobias, who can tell me what this bus is, what it was doing?
It was a Brexit argument?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was trying to convince people that money was available if it's not paid with that.
Yeah. So this was a bus, exactly this, that was being driven around the UK, particularly around England and Wales, during the time of the run-up to the referendum that we had a few weeks ago. So you have the Vote Leave campaign, you have Let's Take Back Control, and you have the big slogan, red bus. This is not subtle. Like, this is not some kind of little casual kind of like, ooh, tiny intervention. This is a bus and it's moving, it's mobile. That says, we, the UK, send the EU 50 million... actually, no, this is the slightly wrong one. It should be 350 million a day. Let's fund the NHS instead. So the implication here is a huge amount of money that's being sent by the UK to the EU, and if we extract ourselves, we can do this. And this was a kind of a claim that was made. Our friend, actually, and colleague Justin Pickard, when we were talking about this, said that what you actually really want from that is it to be, like, as it drives, to be followed by kind of self-driving vehicles that, you know, blaring citation needed as it kind of drives down the street to kind of come with it. So the referendum happened. This thing was very prominent. Most major politicians who were campaigning for Leave were photographed standing in front of it. All of them, pretty much, to a person. And the day after the referendum happened, literally 4 hours later or so, I think it got called about 4 a.m. and 8 a.m., Nigel Farage, then leader of UKIP, on daytime television said, actually, we probably shouldn't have said that. That was like, you know, that wasn't true. That wasn't true. That wasn't real. It got better with Ian Duncan Smith, one of the members of the Conservative Party, who said, with reference to that bust and that claim, our promises were a series of possibilities. So is this real? Is this a speculation? What power does it have if you're convincing the voting patterns of millions of people through something that you're later saying, this is not fact, this is a possibility. But you've had it on a bus. You've had it on a very large material intervention that's been driving around the countryside. So this has been the kind of thing that's always been getting to me, of like, beyond speculative design, and we do it, and we utilise it in various ways, how does it get utilised? How does a speculation, a possibility, get weaponised, get orchestrated? Where does it go? Where does it live? What does it do? There's a very, very big body of work around the sociology of expectations. I can scratch the surface on a little today, and I'm certainly happy to answer questions on, but we're not going to go into huge amounts of depth. What we are going to think about it here is that expectations have tremendous power in terms of marshalling material activity. They make things happen. It's not that this or this will make things happen. It's promises. It's what you expect. It's what you speculate. So there's been a huge amount of work done in science and technology studies by people who have been looking at things like nanotechnology, bioengineering, genetic modification. And you can look at the work that's done in labs, but you can also look at the promises that are made that come out from marketing, from different labs themselves, the claims that we make when we write research proposals, the things that we say when we write our CVs. So expectations are both the cause and consequence of material, scientific and technological activity. And we're going to add today to that economic and cultural and political activity too, if we think about this in terms of elections and anything else. It's what we expect that creates effects, and what I'm interested in is how those effects happen. So what we're going to go through is 3 different examples of how these expectations get marshalled and what they do, and in different ways as well. We're going to be looking at property and Silicon Roundabout and technology clusters, particularly in London, because that's a place where a lot of kind of expectations happen. We're going to be looking at food, and we're going to be looking at activism as well, and symbols particularly. There's very different ways, all very different to what's been happening with the referendum, but different ways that expectations get put into use by different bodies, and what kind of things come at the other end of it as well. And also the expectation of whether something is real, whether, like the robot surgery kit, we expect it to be real, and what the consequences are or not, and who can engage with that too. So we'll start with here. Does this picture look familiar? Anyone? Where is it? Old Street. Old Street. Yeah. Okay. Who has been to Old Street? Does this?
Where is that? Is that in the UK?
It's in East London. Does this look like Old Street? Does it actually look like Old Street? It's very shiny. It's a very kind of very glowing kind of performative thing. So. A bit of context around Old Street itself. Part of East London, for a very long time, has been, it's moved through various kind of life stages. It's always been on the edge of zones in terms of London, where it's never had a huge amount of funding. It missed out on the industrial booms. It's been a place where there's been a large working class population. There's been a large kind of far-right political groups that worked in that area. And from about the 80s onwards, large artist populations moved in. And from the late 90s or so, slowly technology companies started coming to that space too. In the Tony Blair era, when they did the big launch for the cultural ministries, they did it in Old Street. It was held very much the kind of you see, this is it, And this was even before people knew the names of Shoreditch or Dalston or Haggerston. Old Street, East London was where it was. So what's been happening with Old Street is interesting in terms of how particularly government bodies have been trying to create this sense of wonder and expectation and entirely, and visualizing what it could be through a very interesting set of instruments. And this is a bunch of work that I've done with colleagues from London School of Economics, and also from my own work in East London too, of when you look at this space, and you look at what's being offered, and you look at what's trying to be marshalled through, which in this case in forest investment, how does it happen? So this is the idea of the imaginary place, which, for anyone who's come here from outside London, you have an idea in your head of what London might be, or what, Elephant and Castle might be, or what England might be. And in place branding, there's this idea of the imaginary place being developed by selective drawing on and reshaping of existing assets coupled to some improved future state. So place branding involves imaginary futures and reconstructed pasts. It deploys transition fantasies in which new protagonists colonise or take over old spaces for regeneration, and key sites or resident spaces may thus be reclaimed and reconfigured. So what we're talking about here is an imaginary place, something where we can rewrite the past. We can say there are artists here and there's amazing things and they're very sanitised and it might be slightly edgy in some way. Some improved future state. It's going to be great. Things are going to come. It's going to be magic. And the transition fantasy by which you somehow seamlessly get from one point to another. And this is fairly common for regeneration work, particularly in urban planning, of some idea if you're trying to get new buildings made, if you're trying to get money in, you want to be able to present a vision to planners, to funders, that this thing is going to be great. This is what's going to happen. But how it was done around particularly London generally is really, really interesting. So outside of East London, Crystal Benners, who's a colleague, a friendly colleague, has this wonderful blog that I would very strongly recommend having a look at called Development Aesthetics. And what she's done with this has been collecting the renders and the hoardings from around London, and further afield, but mostly London, around all the huge amounts of new building that's going on. And just looking at what those images are and how the future is being sold through buildings. So the type of architecture, and beyond that, the types of graffiti-esque, slightly edgy, it's slightly crazy, but you're going to be safe here. Don't worry, And it's just a fantastic sense of documentation of what imaginary place is being built up by planners. There is generally some sense of reasonability at the buildings. The renders, the little people who are there, generally are very safe, generally very white as well. And there's the skies are always blue, so this is a kind of selling that goes with it as well. And what's interesting as well that she's found with this is that the selling sometimes doesn't actually feature buildings. You're not being sold an imaginary place on behalf of what the building's going to look like, or whether it's got a swimming pool, but of who you could be if you live there, how great that's going to be, that you're going to have that nice dress or that nice suit if you buy this obscenely expensive studio somewhere, probably around Elephant and Castle as well. And of course, what these things do is they live out of context. The hoarding is there, and then it generally sits somewhere like that. And that's not the thing you want to be looking at. You want to be looking towards the future to have an idea if that's where we're going to be going. When it comes, you're going to be wearing a nice dress and just do not look at that. Do not look at the rest of Dalston Kingsland. It's going to be fine. The other thing that comes with these with the collection of it as well, this is something I found, is the little tagline that comes of computer-generated image is indicative only. So we can't necessarily promise you this legally. You might not have that nice dress. The sky might not always be blue, but it's going with that. So what they did in East London was very much like this, but very interesting because it wasn't just the renders itself. They actually reconfigured reality and mapping to try and suck money in. So around the time, just before the London Olympics in 2012, the idea of Silicon Roundabout, that a little tech cluster rose up in East London from a group of people there who had never really intended it to be taken seriously as a name, but unfortunately at the point in time where this bunch of founders started talking about it, there were journalists from the Evening Standard present as well who picked up on it and turned it into an article. And that was the interesting thing of how the media article can realise something. So it got picked up on quite quickly by the then government, who looked at it as an opportunity to try and bring investment funding into East London to boost the cluster for economic growth, but also somehow tie it to the site where the Olympics was in Stratford in East London. Because once the Olympics happened, that was great, but then you'd have all these buildings that were kind of doing nothing. And that kind of cities that host Olympics don't tend to do well afterwards. They're very expensive. You have to do a huge amount of kind of civic infrastructure building. So this was the general plan. This is what was going to happen. They were going to sell East London in some way. They were going to bring in money. It was going to lead to huge amounts of investment in across East London. Generally, London would thrive. Everything was going to be brilliant. So there was huge amounts of, again, the visual stuff. The name Tech City kind of came up as a thing of the naming of it. Silicon Roundabout, I think, was deemed too twee for it. There was, again, that image I showed you initially was kind of featured very prominently as flashy, it's fast, it's brilliant. You can kind of forget the fact it's in actually quite a grotty, horrible bit of East London. The office that I worked in when I was working there, we had nicknamed Shit Office because nothing worked there. Someone said it was like IBM in the 1980s, just grey carpeting, low lighting, the Wi-Fi constantly broke. But this was kind of the sell of it, which was very far removed from the reality of what we were going with on a daily basis with quite damp walls. And yeah, when I asked it, does it look like it? Well, I mean, it kind of looks like this. is, it's a roundabout and it's not a particularly fancy one either. And this is actually taken from one of the better views where I think you've got the one of the shinier tower blocks there and a bit of building work going on too. But the place branding part of this was very much, this is going to be great, this is going to be the super new thing, and you're going to see it. And foreign investors who might not have thrown any money at that might be a little more inclined to throw some money at this, because this looks like something trustworthy. That looks like, why would you really?
Dangerous roundabout.
Yeah.
Is the shiny picture, is it a photo or a render?
Oh, I'm not sure. I think it's a very amped up photo. I don't think it's a. Yeah. Definitely not a render. Definitely not a render. In that case, definitely not a render. No, it's taken with I don't know enough about photography to have that kind of saturation amped up to make it look beautiful, but you can get that angle. But this is particularly with British weather is a little more close to the bone. So this was a sell on it, and again, it's not. If we think back to kind of crystals and development aesthetics, it's not unusual to have this kind of thing. But what again it leads to is this idea of place branding, where you're presenting a sanitized, appealing image of place, which inevitably selects certain elements to be included in official messages, whilst disregarding or erasing other messages. So you're cherry picking the thing that you want to take out and that you want to give as a sell to say to London investors to come. Now, around the same time, so that was kind of the general sell, but the mapping part of this is kind of almost the most interesting part of it, because when this happened, there was a kind of thing of where is this happening? Because you're not just throwing money at something, you're throwing money at something where there's going to be buildings, there's going to be offices, there's going to be startups, there's going to be laptops. And even if it's a primarily digital cluster, which it is, so you're not doing much manufacturing, not much hardware, you still need people in place. It has to be somewhere, something has to happen. So Wired UK at that time also got on board and contacted me about helping them to build a map of where they thought Silicon Roundabout was at the time. And this is the map itself from, I think, January 2013, would that be right? No, yes, okay. So this got built up, and you can probably, I'm not sure if you can see it here, but there's lots of little pins that are colour-coded. That roundabout we were looking at before is now there, so that's the roundabout. So this, again, is a different kind of vision. This comes from Wired. And it was really interesting making this because this is a mapping exercise, and you have choices when you make a map about what you're going to put into it and what you're not. So one of the first things they said was well, who's in this? And in the original thing that had been put in the Evening Standard, there had been about 12 or 15 companies that had been pulled together in about an hour by the chap who'd been asked to do it, and he very much, in his own admission, it was people he knew. So it was a very good closed circle. So we were then asked to kind of reach out and see which other digital companies would be in Silicon Roundabout. But then we vetted them. We made choices about whether this was a company or not. It was digital companies. That was a choice we made. We made choices about where the boundaries were of this. That was a choice we made. We made choices about how this would fit in with the photo taken from a helicopter. So that was a choice we made. So all this stuff starts to bind together, again, into a very selective imagining of what Silicon Roundabout is. And you can kind of see that little gang of orange firms there. That's all the stuff that comes down the rest of Old Street here that wouldn't quite fit on the map. And so it's just it's kind of here, but how do we represent space? ? And when this came out, it was kind of, for the firms who were in it, there was quite a big buzz of we're in Wired, it's exciting, we're on a map. But for those who weren't, there was a bit of what the hell? We thought we're not good enough for you. And a similar mapping exercise happened as well with the materials that were developed by the government to try and bring in foreign investment. This was something that was done more for media reading, but for public investment, they produced this map. So again, I don't know if you can quite see, but I'll point out the main points of this. So again, the third or fourth time, that's the roundabout. So the big shiny building we looked at is there. When we were looking at it from that helicopter view, we were looking down that way, so we were kind of looking at here. And the way they presented it, like I said, this was very much tied into the Olympics, to Olympic Park. So you have Old Street here, you go a bit across the way, you go to Cambridge Heath, and then you go to Olympic Park, and it's over there. And the intimation of this, the idea of this, was look how close together it is. It's one close together East London cluster. It's great. So you throw your money at that, and it will kind of lock it together. The journey time between Old Street and Stratford is not really that. Not really. Emma Van Dorp, who I worked with on this project, on this research, actually had kickstarted it because independently I'd been doing the research on this. She'd been doing her master's thesis at the LSE on urban planning and had looked at this and was just hang on, what? Then we pulled in Max Nathan, who is an urban economist. And what she pointed out was like, you look at that map, that's kind of what it is. Like, that's the thing where you've got like at least a half-hour ride to get there. You know, you can take the central line, you can if you want to, but it's not an easy kind of flow. It's not this kind of seamless, you know, you guys now have done enough travelling around London to know it's not easy. You know, it's not seamless. So all of this was completely eluded by this map that was just like, it's here, like this is what we offer to you, come, give us money. And she was just like, no, that's not what's going on. So that was a kind of a point of, this is one way in which different forms of imagery, but particularly can be marshalled to different forces to give an idea of something, some different story. I know that Paul yesterday was talking about narrative and plot, and this is a kind of way in which the narratives themselves get weaponized, get utilized for different ends. Right, point 2. So one of the other things I've been interested in with this constantly is this is not static. Like these changes, we don't develop something and put it into the world and then it just sits there. Things and expectations change rapidly over time, and they have to as well. They have to keep moving in order to keep abreast of the surrounding context, which gives you an idea that the context itself matters. So again, we'll come back to Borup et al. Like, you know, these technologies and changes don't substantially exist themselves, except their imaginings and expectations. So there's nothing here that arises completely new. Everything is always bound into the context. The context frames it, and the context shapes it as well. So anything that we see and we think about in terms of imaginaries, you know, the stuff in Silicon Roundabout came at that very specific point around the Olympics. So the Olympics was used as a framing device. One of the places where you can see this really, really clearly in a way that's really great and kind of grotesque at points is with food, and how food gets imagined, and particularly how it gets marshalled through science and speculative fiction as well, but also what happens when the ideas of what is real and what is unreal, and particularly the affect around it as well, whether it's revulsion or horror or the political point it wants to make, starts to shift with the context too. So, we're going to start in 1973. Soylent Green? Is there? Yes? Okay. So, this is great. The film itself is, and again, the horrible thing when you try and talk about science and speculative fictions is you end up spoilering everything, so I'm sorry, this next section is spoilers all the way down. Soylent Green came out and was developed at a point post-World War II when there were massive fears about food shortages. So there was a growing population, there were economic groups, huge economic booms, people were living longer, they were healthier. And with that, there was a very, very big fear about how would you feed people? What are you going to do with that? So one of the things that started coming out, particularly with the concurrent rise of industrialised agriculture, was how, again, you could use industrial technologies to produce food. What would that look like? And so the things that they were thinking about, particularly there, were vat-grown algae. This was something that they tried for a while, didn't quite take, was simultaneously presented as, you know, some amazing future that would come, but was also met with a level of revulsion publicly about what it would mean to move away from natural farm-grown food and into a space where the provenance of food, the origin of food, is much, much less certain. So Soylent Green comes out of that time specifically, and it's based on a book that was published earlier, about the idea of we have enough food to feed, just about enough food to feed a large population, but there are still food shortages, and we have wafers which kind of act as a stand-in for algae. And at the end of the film, we find out that Soylent Green, the most desirable of like all the 4 types of Soylent Blue, Soylent Yellow, Red and Green, Soylent Green is in fact made of people. It's not made of algae, it's made of people. So this horrifying tie-in of like, we can't feed everyone, even the technologies we've got are going to fail us, this is the context. And this idea of kind of like lab-grown, particularly lab-grown yeast and these kind of weird provenance things of what is it? Is it real? Kind of grotesque. Oh my god. Was held up very strongly for a while until it actually started to break out into the real, which is basically what this is. So this is, I think it's a very British thing. I haven't seen it much elsewhere, but there are kind of variations of it as well. This is mycoprotein. It's mushroom protein. It's grown in fats. It's basically the thing they couldn't do in the 1940s and 50s, and now they can do it here, and you can make mince out of it. It's quite tasty, and it's texturally interesting. So all the kind of horror that's kind of bound into, oh my god, food in vats is like, if you've ever had like a corn sausage, you're just like, it's there, that's all right. The affect that gets associated with it starts to shift quite radically. And so that means the kind of the nature of what becomes horrifying and what can be imagined and like the type of effect that you want to have with it has to start shifting too. So this I think is also from the Corn Factory, and this is corn nuggets, which is quite a nice chicken substitute, works quite well. But again, it's mass produced, it's food, it's made of vegetable protein, it's broadly all right. There are questions about like issues of water use that come with it as well, but it's not that full horrifying, where is the end of the supply chain for this? You know, where does this come from? We've kind of got a sense of that. So the nature of what becomes horrifying started to shift. And so this is kind of mass-produced false chicken. And in Oryx and Crake, which is a book, so this is an illustration I found of it, you go the other way for what artificial chicken is, which is now starting to talk about genetic modification as the new fear. So stuff and that's kind of, okay, fine. Artificial meat becomes the new one. And so she talks about here this idea of genetic modification of a chicken such that it basically produces nothing but nuggets. It's got a kind of feeding tube in it, and then you pluck these off, and this is kind of the end point. So we start to think about this is actually the new affect, the new horror of where this goes as well. And this actually, the lab-grown meat stuff is interesting because it's tended to persist until very recently as a kind of form of horror, but also as a form of like what is real versus what is artificial meat as well. This is something that The Matrix played on very, very nicely as well, where actually one of the crux points of the entire film is someone selling out their entire crew for steak. Not really, this idea they're getting, as opposed to slop, they're getting actual real meat. So real meat is luxury. Real meat is the thing that requires, again, resources, animals, land, growth, as opposed to something that's more artificial than that. And that kind of rides through. But again, then, once this stuff starts to hover on the horizon, how we engage with it starts to shift as well. One of the earlier projects that was done by the Studio Berg, and I think this came out of Jack Schultz's work at the RCA, was the idea of how we could actually think about lab-grown meat. So if you're not thinking about it as horrifying, what's the context in which it sits? If you are going to grow part of a kangaroo in a pet dish, well then how do you engage with it? Is it something that we think about, again, as luxury? Does the fact that it's being scientifically processed, you know, it comes from this rich kind of context of technological innovation. Can we see this as something more high-end? How can we reframe it? And it's a really nice, very simple little project, but one that kind of locates through origami animals the idea of artificial meat in different contexts, which is not horrifying and is not cheapened, but is something that's actually, you know, it might be desirable in some way. Except, of course, then it happens, and then we have lab-grown burgers, you know. So this, I think, this was culture. This is, again, a question of like what it means to be actually meat as well, but this thing came out. They did taste tests on it, a bit mushy, we'll come back to that later. So like not necessarily tasty, but this thing is present now. We have it. So suddenly we'll get all the kind of the run up to kind of what is lab-grown meat. It's here. So how do we reframe that again? So we go another step out as well. This is still from the film Antiviral, that I didn't think anyone's seen. Okay, I strongly recommend it. It's full-on body horror. It's directed by the son of David Cronenberg, so it still carries a lot of that kind of ideas with it. One of the things that comes through it, without spoiling it too much, it's set in the near future, and it's very much about the idea of our biological relation to celebrity. So what could happen if there's a celebrity that you quite like and they have a cold sore and a company would culture that cold sore and you could have it too. So you could have the same cold sore as Kate Blanchett. You could have the same, right, so this is kind of how the film basically, you could have the same eczema, maybe not eczema, but something quite horribly viral as, oh gosh, I don't know, John Wayne, what does that look like? It's a lovely concept. The film itself does very clever things, but one of the things that actually run through it from the meat sense is like, okay, what happens if you could culture muted cells and turn them into meat from celebrities? Like, what happens if you culture the cell line and turn it into steak? And that's basically what's going on here. The major celebrity who runs through the film, this woman here, has also kind of sold off part of her cell line to a meat production company so that people can eat steak, which is her, which is not her, which is her. And it's genuinely, like, that point in the film when it comes to it, was like, oh, God, yes.
There's a relation between like the symbolic relationship and what it means to these people. I mean, I haven't seen the film, but like it seems like they're really nuanced ways of unpacking that symbolic relationship. It's not like technically. I mean, maybe technically it is her, but like it's really you're not. These aren't cannibals.
No, absolutely. It's a very clever, nice done reading of it. It's exactly that thing. What it proximity to power, the kind of biological kind of consumption that comes with it as well. Almost a form of worship as much as anything else in its own way. The people who are doing this are very much, particularly from the kind of the viral points of superpowers. So what does it mean to commune through biological in this way? What kind of church are you worshipping at if you're getting a cold sore of a celebrity injected into your upper lip? I don't know if you're going to do a film club as part of this, but I strongly recommend this film. But then we have this, but then we kind of like to come back full circle again. I started off with Soylent, and we have now Soylent as the actual design product, as a thing. The naming of it is maybe interesting, as like a full protein aspect, a full kind of, full nutrient package as well. And then we get to the kind of the final stage, which something that I found when I was in America, of Beyond Meat. I don't know if anyone's had this as the next stage. So this is the full loop of what we're doing with creating artificial food. A lot of the earlier stuff was engendered to try and support people who wanted to be vegetarian or vegan and try and make it moderately tasty, but also emphasise that this was not real. You were not eating real meat. Beyond Meat is developed by scientists out of Stanford, who were looking at specifically the qualities that meat cooked makes it kind of brown and tasty, and isolated some of the chemicals that did this out of beets. So what you've got with this kind of this vegetable protein line that's been genetically modified to have kind of this beet protein means it's both pink and it's chewy and it bleeds when you cook it as well. And the idea for this, again, of who are we trying to reach here, what's being engendered, is reaching out to people who are meat eaters and don't want to be vegetarians. So you're making, again, the choices that are being made here are not about trying to convert, they're about trying to shift consumption patterns in a way that you're still eating, you're definitively eating meat.
Without modifying behavior.
Yeah, without modifying behavior, exactly.
Well, in a way, it's kind of not though. I feel like the projects that kind of try to use synthetic or try to use advances in food processes or biology to make these type of things, or just catering to people's shitty habits. And so I don't understand why there is a push to instead of just letting people know and helping them make decisions not to continue this way, and just sort of pandering to them and trying to curb them from their own behavior. It just seems like it's kind of a waste of advancements like this, where we're just trying to pull one over on people who refuse to change their.
So this may be or may not be what Dan talked about this afternoon. There's very interesting choices being made here about design for behavioural change, versus design for products, and kind of how those two things work together as well. And particularly coming back to resources, which gets funded as well, and which is seen as the way that can be introduced into a marketplace or can be introduced through different kind of policy shifts as well. And to be brutally honest, what the returns on it are as well. Is this a profitable product? How kind of what will come through that as well? But I don't know if that's what Dan's talking about. But kind of design for behavioural change.
Design for intent stuff.
Yeah, design for intent is kind of very much tied into kind of the choices that are being made to kind of pull that back as well. But this one is interesting. It's also, it's a very specific. I don't say localized marketplace. It comes out of San Francisco. I think the test bed for it has been there. Yeah, of course. Where there's also the vegan cheese people who are making cheese out of yeast, but in actually a very kind of carefully mediated way. The bigger systemic stuff is really interesting about where the money goes for in this as well, and also again that this comes out. If it was from not probably any other university, but it comes out of Stanford Labs, kind of adds this kind of extra stuff in there too, which again comes back to what we'll come to this about power and how that works as well. Right. But I'll move on, but come back to the bit. Okay, so the final bit for this is kind of how things get transformed. What happens if things are seen as real or not real, and how this works as well. There's a reason I've been using the stick men throughout this as well, in various states of horror. And this comes through the final project, which has been done by some folks in Boston. So, this is not the project, but this is kind of the starting point as the intervention. Have you seen this here? So this was a small project done by some students at the New School at Parsons. New York subway map. Little island here is Rikers Island, where there are, I think the numbers are 10,000 people, 10,000 people incarcerated, but it's not labelled on the subway map. So everything else, again, the politics of mapping, everything is labelled on the maps. but that little island is not. So if you're looking at it, it's just a thing. It's a plot in the ocean. What could it be? And what they did was like, this is outrageous. You know, what's it mean to like not be able to acknowledge the prison population, basically in the heart of New York? How do we draw attention to it? So for a lot of kind of mapping things around American maps, you have this little kind of circle, a red thing that says you are here, and you know where you are. And so what they did was they made some clear peel-off stickers, and stickers, by the way, are just glorious forms of tiny interventions. They made clear peel-off stickers that you probably can't quite see, but that says Rikers is here. And then they went around the subway and they stuck them on. So this was a kind of like reconfiguring an existing infrastructure, an existing system, just to give this extra bit of little information of like, this is it, this is here, this is real. Okay, so that's our starting point.
Did they get fined for that?
Did
they get fined for that?
I don't think so. I remember wandering around outside Parsons around the time it was happening, and like people were just kind of, you know, there's a lot of stickers in places, you know, so and you can, I think they're peelable off, but yeah, that was their kind of little into it, right? This is the Accessible Disability Icon logo, which was designed in 1968 and is fairly prevalent. It's a universal. It was designed as a way to be able to put a symbol somewhere to indicate where there might be different needs around different forms of physical ability, maybe in terms of steps, in terms of bathroom access, in terms of how accessible basically this might be. It's been in use for a very long time, and I think quite similar to the New York subway maps, it kind of is so in use in the background. You see this, you kind of know what it is, you don't maybe think too much about it. And some friends in Boston who have both worked quite strongly, intensely around disability studies and design have been looking at this for a while and thinking this kind of doesn't work. This is a very passive symbol. Like, this is not indicating someone who has agency. This is not someone indicating someone who has action. It's kind of something background. It doesn't indicate more than that. So what they came up with was what was meant to be intended initially in the first instance as a form of design activism to rethink what the logo was. So what they did was they came up with, this was Sarah Hendrimer from Olin and Brian Gleason, they came up with a new logo that was active, that was, you know, showed the person actually moving, having agency, being able to kind of not just sit there, but actually taking things forward themselves. And again, it was originally just intended as a piece of, not even provocation, but reframing the context. So you can kind of see it layered over here of the difference between what it means to have kind of the static person sitting and leaning in the background versus the active person moving forward themselves. So they developed this as a stencil. They did, as with the Rikers map, they started applying it in different places as well, just to have that. And it's still the symbol, right? It's still a symbol about access and mobility, and all sorts of other things kind of tied up with it as well. But they wanted to kind of get it to a point of saying, you know, this is reframing. We want you to rethink what this actually means itself. And then it took off. So this thing that was meant to be a little intervention, suddenly, like, people saw it and were just like, this is kind of great. Like, unlike the stickers, you don't need a sticker, you just need a stencil. So once you've got a stencil, you don't even have to kind of go over anything. You can make an entirely new one. You can make something yourself. So people started making their own. They started, you know, spray painting it. They started putting it in their own parking lots. They started finding places where this thing could kind of live outside of sitting onto the existing symbol, but something where it could be actually brought into the world and made real in its own way as well. Until it got to the point where it became real. And is now, you know, very heavily adopted, particularly, I think, more in the northeast corner of the US, kind of again, because it came out of Boston and Cambridge and spreads out from that corner as well, but kind of came out from that space, and is now, versions of it are the real. So it's kind of, again, and this felt like a happier example than the referendum, but there's this point of, what does this stuff do when it's taken seriously? What happens when you do see these things, see actually that could work? You know, even if it's not necessarily intended to be that way, what does it matter? So, I'm aware that I'm kind of broadly at time, so I'm going to finish more with questions than comments. I guess the biggest stuff, and also for you guys this week as well, of is it real and does it matter? With the question of what reality is, whether it's time zones, whether it's financial promises, whether it's spray painting, to whom? What is it meant to do? Is it meant to make people vote? Is it meant to make people think? Is it meant to bring in foreign investment? Is it meant to make people scared or hungry or angry? Who is intending this? Is it the designer? Is it the author? How much authorial intent or control here? What is being set up as an expectation of this and around it? If you engage with this, do you expect certain things to happen? Are they definitely going to happen? Is it a promise or more of a set of possibilities? What is that? What role does context and agency play in this? So where does this live? One of the questions I think that Tobias and I've had certainly for a lot of work we've been doing is like, what happens when this goes outside of the white space for gallery? When it's different people who are engaging with it? What happens if it's part of a policy white paper? What happens if it's in the road? What happens if it's in an electoral promise? What happens if it's stitched onto a baseball cap? Make America Great Britain again. And what role does agency here? And by agency I mean self-control. Like, how much control do you have over the situation? Is it something people can intervene into? If it's a piece of robot surgery, can you build it? Can you buy it? Maybe not. Can you make a stencil? Probably you can. So what can you do? And finally, where are the lines of power and control around the work? Where is it being pushed from? How widespread is it? Is it a very expensive bus that's driving around the place? Is it something low key? Is it being distributed online? Is it being texted to people? Where can you see it? Who controls it? What happens if you do try to intervene in it? What happens if you try to question it? What happens if you try to use it? I'm going to leave it there. There's a bunch of stuff we can talk about, or we can talk about antiviral and the horror of meat. And I can certainly talk a lot more about the sociology of expectations. But yeah, thank you very much.